I am Daniel Benjamin, and I have the honor and the pleasure of being the president of the American Academy in Berlin, and I want to welcome you to this evening's lecture, The Art of Graphic Resurrection by Amy Kurzweil, who is this fall's Dirk Ippen Fellow at the American Academy in Berlin. The Dirk Ippen Fellowship was established in 2012 with the generous support of our Academy trustee, Dirk Ippen, who many of you know publishes an array of different German newspapers, including the Münchner Merkur, the Frankfurter Rundschau, and many others. Past Ippen Fellows have included Jeffrey Goldberg, now the editor of the Atlantic Monthly, Dominique Nabokov, a very distinguished photographer. Those of you who read the New York Review of Books will be familiar with her work, and classicist Michelle Lowry. Now, I'm going to begin by making a personal confession. I took this job in part so that I could host events like this one, particularly because I'm a huge fan of the tradition of the American cartoon, and especially the New Yorker cartoon, which is really one of America's great cultural creations. It may not be like jazz, but it's a really big deal. And so I was thrilled when I saw that Amy Kurzweil was coming here, and I very much consider her as working in that tradition. And I'm clearly not the only person around who has this high regard for these cartoons. It's noteworthy if you walk around the Academy, we have a fair amount of work that was done by former fellows and distinguished visitors. But if you go up to the executive suite, the things that are hanging on the wall are cartoons by the great Lee Lawrence and also by Jules Feiffer. And that all suggests that one of my predecessors, at least one of my predecessors, felt exactly the same way. So, this is pretty thrilling, and I think this turnout shows it as well. Now, I have to say, I'm also thrilled to have live people here again, although I look forward to seeing you at the dinner table so that I can see your faces. Now back to Amy. So beginning with her first book, The Flying Couch, which came out in 2016, she described her maternal grandmother's escape from the Warsaw ghetto and her family's Holocaust legacy. She's going to talk about that tonight. She's also going to talk about her work in progress, Artificial, which documents the life of her paternal grandfather, a Viennese musician who escaped the Nazis in 1938, and also will look into her father's quest to resurrect his father through artificial intelligence. And that, in turn, leads to all kinds of pondering of the central questions of Amy Kurzweil's work. I have to say, I also feel delighted because I got to see a preview of this when Amy did an online talk for us last year. She is, I don't know, would we call you a COVID baby or something? That you had to be delayed a year to get here to take up your fellowship, but we're thrilled she's here now. So after all that, you'll be amused to learn that it's actually not my job to introduce Amy. I am going to be introducing the introducer. That is just one of the indignities of my job. And her introducer tonight is Laura Moser. Laura is an American author and sometime politician who is now living in Berlin. She was born in Houston, Texas, where her grandfather fled in 1942 as a refugee from Nazi Germany. She was educated at Amherst College and has worked as an editor, author, and journalist with bylines from all kinds of great places, including the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, Slate, Vogue, and the Jewish Daily Forward, among others. She is also the author of a passel of young adult novels and of other nonfiction books as well, some of them Times bestsellers. Following the 2016 election of Donald Trump, she founded something called Daily Action, a text messaging service that allows people to engage directly in the political process. And I guess more than 300,000 people have participated in Daily Action. In 2017, she moved back to her home congressional district in Texas to run for Congress. So she's truly an engaged citizen. Unfortunately, she was narrowly defeated in the primary. After that, she and her family in 2020 moved to Berlin, a move that she documented earlier this year in an article for The New Yorker, which I read when it came out and was amazed by it. So congratulations by that. We're just surrounded by The New Yorker tonight. Anyway, it's a great piece on a really complicated issue, and she's moved back into the neighborhood where her grandfather lived. I'm not going to try to describe it. Get your own copy. I heartily recommend it. So with that, Laura, I want to thank you for joining us tonight. You'll get to do the honors of the interrogation of Amy, the introduction and interrogation of Amy. And let me just say, for those who are joining us via Zoom, after Amy's talk, you'll be able to ask questions. You can actually start asking questions anytime you want. Do not raise your hand. Do not hit that funny button because no one will notice. Please do send your questions into the Q&A function on the Zoom screen, and we'll get to as many as we can. And with that, Laura, thank you so much for joining us.
Can I unmask? Yes. I cannot infect anyone from here. Thank you so much. Thank you, Amy, for inviting me. And it is my great pleasure to reintroduce Amy tonight and to tell you sort of about my connection. You hit many of the highlights, but there's a long list of places. Can you hear me? Where her excellent cartoons are published. And I also just wanted to say a personal word about Flying Couch, which is about her grandmother's escape from the Warsaw Ghetto, but also her kind of suburban American experience of inheriting that trauma and how that filters down through 3 generations of Jewish women in America and Europe. And that is a subject, Alec, who is here somewhere, connected me and Amy earlier this fall because Amy was looking for Jewish community in Berlin, which for people with our background is a very fraught quest in this environment. And so we connected, and she likes my cats, which is probably, for me, she chose the right cat when she walked into my apartment. A very great recommendation of her. So her other, she's also going to talk a lot about her new book, Artificial: A Love Story, tonight, which is about an attempt to resurrect through artificial intelligence and chatbots. I think her paternal grandfather, who fled Vienna in 1938, which is the same year that my grandfather fled West Berlin. And I think our grandfathers died at the exact same age of heart disease. And one could say that even those who escaped died of broken hearts. So I guess I just really wanted to end this with 2 quotes from a piece that Amy wrote about receiving hate mail from random men on the internet, which is something else I relate to almost as much as the Holocaust inheritance, as every writer who is female understands. And I just thought that these 2 quotes really captured what is so special about Amy's writing and the heart that comes across both in her pictures and her prose. And it's very rare, and I think it's as important an accomplishment as anything else that she will talk about tonight. She wrote, I have to like writing better than being loved, and I have to like it better than being nice, but I don't want to toughen up. I want the world to soften. And I think, especially on these subjects, that's the most important quality that one could bring to it. And then the last thing is, I became a writer because I notice too much, feel too much, need to share. The sensitive child survival turned career. I want to be a charitable writer, to see the world from beyond my tribal loyalties. I'm capable of being this kind of writer because I believe that everyone is fundamentally reasonable. How to stay charitable while staying safe. How to see the world clearly, openly, from the defenses I need to get through a woman's life. So on that segue to war and remembrance and artificial technology, intelligence, whatever. Amy, take it away.
Hello. Thank you, Laura. That was really moving. I really appreciate you being here. Thank you, Daniel Benjamin. It's been really strange and amazing and wonderful to be here in Berlin I'm excited to see my Jewish community here. I'm excited to be here with the other fellows who just like continue to inspire me. I think we're all still like, our brains are still whirring from Bertrand's talk last night, and I'm going to try to keep us going in that tradition. And just a special thank you to the Academy and the people who work behind the scenes at the Academy. Thank you, John, especially for coordinating this talk. And there's just so many people who work here so hard, so I just want to thank you for having me. Okay, I thought we could just jump right into looking at some single panel cartoons, like just to kind of like loosen up. And yeah, so the deal with cartoons is you're not required to laugh, but you're invited to laugh. So just, you know, if you feel like laughing, you can laugh. And while I show you some cartoons, I'll also talk a little bit about my relationship to this art form and what I feel like cartooning allows me to do. Like, what can I do with pictures that I can't always do with words alone? Okay. So here we have literary dogs. Working on the pig's ear keeps me busy, but my dream is to chew the next great American bone. So I started as a writer. Words were my pig's ear of choice, and I was not the kid who could draw particularly well. I was always drawing, but I never heard from art teachers, you know, like, you're a great artist. Like, that wasn't what I heard. So my entry into this art form is through writing, and that's what I studied. I was drawn to the comic world because I was fascinated by this process of reality becoming symbols. And in the world of comics and cartoons, symbols become their own language. Images become their own language. Here we have stress-inducing coloring book for adults. So in the world of cartoons, as opposed to the world of fine art and painting, my drawing goals can be the simplification of the extraordinarily complex visual world into only what's meaningful for narrative content. So in the kind of comics that I make, drawing is a language for communication, not representation, and not decoration. And like, this would, you know, be too much, too much for me. Here we have Joe's abbreviations. Also in the cartoon world, there's this slipperiness between word and image that I find to be really interesting and really mysterious. I think this is part of what drew me to this form, that like words and images are always blurring and bleeding into each other. And in comics, words and images play different roles, but it's a dance, and the distinction between them is often blurry. Comics have allowed me to combine symbols in the visual world that help me say something expansive but concise. I think of cartooning as the art of juxtaposition. So you're basically putting things next to each other, fitting them together, and allowing for what resonance that enables. And speaking of technology, this is the first cartoon I sold to the New Yorker. So here we have self-driving car, self-conscious car, would I look better in red, and self-actualized car, I'm going back to school. So this process, this question and process of AI self-actualizing, we're getting there, so we'll just leave that for now, and we'll get there by the end of the talk. And this is the last cartoon I'll show you. Books. 3 p.m., meet the author. 3:10 p.m., tweet negative reviews at the author. 3:25 p.m., meet the author's disappointed parents. 3:30 p.m., meet the author's spouse who has raised the author's children on a single earner's salary. Okay. Totally not relatable at all for anyone in here, of course. Okay, so no, please don't tweet negative reviews of this talk. And now I'm gonna get into talking about my book. So I'll talk a little bit about my first book, and then we'll end with my work in progress. So a question I get a lot in regard to my memoirs is why comics? Like, cartoons make sense maybe as a way to sort of entertain and make people laugh, but why am I drawn to this art form as a way of documenting memory and picturing history? What does drawing allow me to do that I can't do with words or with photographs? And hopefully this talk will answer that question. And I'll just say two things about the cover of my book. The first is that it sparkles. And the second is Miriam Caton, who's got her blurb on the book, is here in the audience, so I'm just really happy that Miriam's here. So, yeah. All right, so Flying Couch is a graphic memoir about 3 generations of Jewish women in my family. There's me, the artist. There's my mother, Sonia. She was born in a displaced persons camp in 1946 in Bensheim, Germany. She immigrated to the United States when she was 4. She grew up in Michigan, and she became a psychologist. And then there's the hero of my book, my grandmother, Lily, who I call Bubby. She's a Holocaust survivor from Warsaw, Poland, and she's still alive. She's 95 years old. So when I was in college, my mother gave me a transcription of an oral history that my grandmother had done with a historian at the University of Michigan. And this physical gift, like my mother gave me this like printed out document, and I carried it around with me. That was the catalyst for my whole project. Flying Couch explores my relationship with my mother and my grandmother and my own search for identity in the wake of their histories. It weaves my personal memories through Bubby's story in her own words of escaping the Warsaw ghetto through a few bricks in the wall, the death one by one of her entire family, her survival in disguise as a Catholic orphan, her eventual liberation, her marriage to my grandfather, my mother's birth in a DP camp in Bensheim, Germany, and the new family's immigration to America. I wanted to tell my grandmother's story in order to understand something about myself, to draw a line from my preoccupations and concerns through the bodies that raised me and the spaces I grew up in to the past. Through juxtaposition, simply putting my grandmother's high arc dramas next to my relatively banal American experiences, I could trace the traumas of the past to the present, seen in the small compulsions that linger and the fears and attachments that persist. I hope the picture of my experience would resonate with the shared condition of Holocaust inheritance and with other communities who've had tragic stories imprinted upon them. I started Flying Couch as my undergraduate thesis project, and as I mentioned, I didn't have visual art training, but reading books like Mouse and Persepolis and other books in this tradition invited me into this art form. And it struck me that the simplicity of comics, like the naive aesthetic, had something to do for me with why these stories felt so real. And this feeling of realness was related to a sense of intimacy that I felt with the artist. And the intimacy of comics lives in the hand-drawn line. So, despite and perhaps because of my naivete at the time, I decided that I was just going to draw a whole book. And I learned quickly that there was a special kind of knowledge that drawing gave me. Drawing is a kinesthetic experience. When I draw, my body is always moving. My hand and arm never stop gliding across paper. When I'm inking, I actually time my breathing to my brush strokes. The physicality of drawing helps me tap into emotional knowledge. So an example of this is when I draw facial expressions, I can't help but put the expression on my own face as I'm trying to draw it. So like in order to picture exactly where in the arc of the eyebrows is the expression of anxiety or worry or hope or joy, I involuntarily embody that expression as a way of coming to knowledge about how to represent it. And similarly, when I draw abstractions to represent some emotion or some quality in a scene, I have to bring a certain quality into my arm. So like I might scratch aggressively at the paper for rage, or I might bring like a lightness or buoyancy into my arm for abstractions that code as more joyful. And so in this way, drawing helped me embody the emotions of the past. In the moment of drawing these pages, which is the moment you're watching, I was bringing a thread of the emotional life of the past into my arm and onto my face. And the drawings that emerge in my book are not realistic, but they are expressive. And juxtaposed with the text, they make the story feel real because they're evidence of somebody's emotional experience. And my drawings are an attempt to picture that which was once felt. And in doing so, I'm resurrecting that feeling into my own body. This page is the moment when my grandmother learned that the war was over, and she describes watching people coming from the camps singing joyfully. So she was not in the camps, but she has this memory of watching these women express joy at their liberation. My work is engaged with the limitations of representation. There were things in my grandmother's story that I couldn't represent in images, either because they were too big or too horrible. And there were certain things I couldn't represent because I didn't have access to knowledge about them. So one example of this is I don't have any photographs. We don't have any photographs in my family of any of my grandmother's family members. So she had 4 sisters, a mother, a father, a grandmother, and all of them died before the end of the war. So it felt important to me not to misrepresent what they looked like. And so in order to make reference to this felt absence, I decided to obscure their faces whenever I drew them, either through various framing devices or perspective choices like this. And generally, I think comics have this great potential to make what's not depicted feel just as meaningful as what is depicted. And since so few photographs of my grandmother's early life were available to me in drawing my book, the photographs that I did have took on a special significance. Most of these come from Germany. So this, for example, is the Tanzschule Richter, which is this ballroom dance studio in Bensheim where my mother and her parents lived briefly once they left the DP camp. And in order to highlight and distinguish these photographs, I decided to render them in this more realistic aesthetic. And these photos are from the DP camp in Germany. That's my mom in a little bucket. Such a cute photograph. So with this shift to a more realistic style, I wanted to say to the reader, look, this photograph really exists. And I'm offering you a different kind of proof that all of this really happened. What then emerged in Flying Couch were these 2 different registers of memory. The first is the aesthetic register of the recollected, the cartoonish style which represents images that came from my mind. They're emotionally expressive, they're imbued with imagination, and they more readily facilitate that feeling of intimacy that I noted in the graphic memoirs I first admired. Comics theorist Scott McCloud suggests that this intimacy I keep referencing has to do with our brain's penchant to project animation onto simple shapes and lines. So when something contains visual gaps, we fill it in with the projection of our own minds. When we look at realistic images, he says, we see the face of another, but when we look at simple faces, we see ourselves. So according to this theory, my cartoonish style may encourage you to see something of your own face in the simple drawings of my characters' faces, and therefore feel closer to me and my family's story. And the second aesthetic register, the realistic register, represents documentation by mechanical reproduction. This is the kind of proof that institutions and authorities tend to have a bias towards. This aesthetic creates distance, but this is also important because it suggests to the reader the story isn't about you. It does not only exist for your projection. It's about real people from history who experienced events that really happened. Okay, this distinction between human and machine approaches to documenting the past is a good segue into my second book, which is what I'm here at the Academy to work on, Artificial: A Love Story. And this book turns to the family history on my father's side and asks the question, how does technology help us preserve the past? What does it offer, and what does it leave out? The book tells the story of my paternal grandfather, a brilliant conductor and pianist from Vienna who escaped the Nazis in 1938 and immigrated to New York, where my father was born. Fritz Kurzweil, known in America as Fred, had his life saved because a wealthy American benefactor, a woman named Gertrude Sumner Ellie, heard a choral concert he conducted in 1937. She was so impressed with his work, she told him to write to her if he ever needed anything. Soon, the next year in March, came the Anschluss, and Fritz needed out of Europe. He wrote to her, and she sponsored his visa to the United States. He left a month before Kristallnacht. Artificial doesn't so much tell my grandfather's story, but it revolves around it. The book chronicles my inventor father's attempt to animate and, in a sense, resurrect his father's identity through artificial intelligence and the documents he's been saving in a storage unit since Fred's death in 1970. Using natural language understanding technology, my father built a chatbot, which uses my grandfather's letters, notes, lectures, and other writings as source material. You enter a question, and the bot returns answers based on this pre-written corpus of text. Chatting with the bot simulates, in stops and starts, a rudimentary experience of talking with Fred. And as this technology matures, as my father predicts, the social experience will become more seamless, less uncanny, until one day, perhaps, this kind of resurrection will be compelling not as a technological oddity, but as a profound communion with a past person. My father, born in Queens in 1948, has been interested in artificial intelligence since before most people had ever heard that phrase. He built a career inventing machines and algorithms whose capabilities encroach on human intelligence. And he believes we're headed towards a machine intelligence explosion, referred to as the singularity, a point at which artificial intelligence so vastly supersedes human intelligence, we can't even imagine it. Okay, so to introduce my father a little bit further, I'm going to play this clip of him as a 17-year-old boy. This is from 1965. So you'll hear the actual audio and then you'll get my sketches alongside.
Secret, starring Steve Allen. My name is Raymond Kurzweil, and I'm from Queens, New York. Queens, New York. Well, panel, Raymond and I just happened to have brought along this little piano here, as you see. And Raymond, in addition, also happens to have, as the old saying goes, happens to have a piece of music with him. And before we show the audience what his secret is, we have just a few seconds for Raymond to play this piece of music. Raymond, the piano's all yours. Played, and now your performance, of course, leads into your secret, so if you'll whisper it to me, we'll let everybody at home know what's up. That certainly deserves applause, but what has it got to do with the music? I don't understand that. I see.
All right. So the next thing I want to share with you is a section from my book that is actually fully inked. I inked this just a few weeks ago here at the Academy. And this is my father 50 years after that TV appearance in an interview with me. And my book has a series of interviews between me and my father, and this is the beginning of that interview. And he's talking in this clip about the vision for this chatbot of his father. And these are what the pages look like from a distance. And now I will bring it to life for you. Okay. Don't be scared. Say something. This is Ray Kurzweil talking to Amy Kurzweil. Click, click. Okay. All right, thank you for doing this. I know you have a long day and you have to get up at 5 a.m. I have to leave at 5. I have to get up at 4. Okay. So the first question I wanted to ask you, why did you originally save your father's documents? Did you anticipate their future life? Well, I just have this instinct that information is precious. I mean, he kept all that information. And we are information, our memories, our skills, our personalities. You could see that negatively, like we're just information, Or you could see it positively, like information is spiritual. A person is information. We are patterns of information. The substrate changes. I make the analogy with a river. Is the Charles River still there? Isn't the water completely different than it was yesterday? It changes in milliseconds, but the pattern of water persists. We are like a river, too. Our particles change constantly. Our patterns change gradually. But there is continuity from the 5-year-old Ray to the 70-year-old Ray. How would you define the relationship between a recreated avatar of Fred and Fred? Is that a different kind of identity relationship than you to your 5-year-old self? I think it is different. In some ways, the recreation would be closer to Fred just before he died than I am to my 5-year-old self, because there hasn't been gradual change. But there isn't continuity. And there isn't, yet, a perfect recreation of patterns. So it is different. But if it's really done well, I could develop a relationship with it that's similar to the relationship I did have. Although, I'm different. So in this theoretical future, where people continue to have relationships with avatars of people who've passed away, will there be a kind of Turing test for specific identities? Yes, I've referred to a Frederick Kurzweil Turing test, which means the avatar, if it passes, is indistinguishable from, but who's the authority? Right, you can't really run a test like that. You could contemplate it theoretically. I mean, how many people are around now who knew Fred well? Wouldn't you all have your own metric? Right, and by the time we actually do this test, some of those people might not be around anymore. A later stage, around 2029, is that you could create an avatar that itself has human intelligence and is human-like and would pass just a general Turing test. Once you can do that, you can have the AI consider all the material it has on this particular person. That'll be much more convincing. And the AI should, while it's at it, interview all the people who knew this person. Now that's getting more difficult because there are fewer people who have any recollection of him. And for those of us who do, they're getting dim. I mean, I don't have a lot. I have some recollections, but not a lot of specific recollections. I mean, he died half a century ago. Are you familiar with this concept? It was in the movie Coco. Have you seen it? Not yet. An idea from Mexican mythology. There are 2 deaths. The first is when you die, and the second is when people forget you. Your project resonates with that. Like, as long as there are people around who remember Fred, he's sort of still alive, able to be resurrected. So, a key thread of my interest in this project has to do with the way in which my father's technological preservation intersects with what I do as a writer and an artist. I'm motivated to preserve first-person history because I think it's important to remember the past, to see it clearly so we can learn from it, better understand ourselves, and treat people better. And my father is motivated to preserve because he thinks loss is a tragedy and it's human destiny to transcend that helpless position. The questions about truth and documentation that preoccupied me in my first book have become relevant in a new way considering my father's project. With technological portraits, is the authority of the mechanical superseding other ways of knowing? In a chatbot, is there space to understand the limitations of what it can capture and what it can't? In order to think about this question, I began to think about myself and my role as a documenter of human life in relation to an algorithm tasked with the same goal. And one of the interesting differences between me and an algorithm is that the algorithm uses language and conceptual modeling as the basis for its intelligence, whereas I also have a body and this kind of kinesthetic embodied knowledge that I talked about earlier, the kind of knowledge that I tap into when I draw. My book is full of laboriously hand-copied documents. I've traced the words and images of my grandfather's life. And it's been important to me to hand draw these documents. And here you're getting insight into how I do that, this process with my light box and tracing and then close looking. This is how I create that photorealistic aesthetic that you see in my books. Drawing is a way of seeing. I get so much information about, for example, how a person fills space when my hand moves along the lines of their face with a pencil. When I draw, I notice infinite detail. So much of everyday looking is about summarizing and filling in. But when I draw something realistically, I enter a vast and granular level of visual nuance, and I realize how incredibly complex reality is. I then have to decomplexify the visual nuance I encounter in order to translate reality into cartoon. This is a complicated but organic process. And the better I know somebody and the more often I've drawn them, the easier it is for me to point to their essential features as I perceive them. Tracing and drawing my grandfather's face, his handwriting, the documents of his life, have become a way to get to know him. My drawing every document in my book also emphasizes to the reader that even when I point to the existence of mechanically reproduced items that have contributed to my knowledge of the past, the story is still filtering through my perception. A comic wears its artifice on its sleeve. This artifice, as I mentioned, is also its intimacy. The awareness of the author's presence, the feeling of their hand in every drawn line. That's the appeal of comics. The sense that a comic world does not look like reality is a way of asserting the importance of the individual perspective while maintaining its subjectivity. So, how am I to understand something like a chatbot's representation of the reality of the past? Who is its author? What and where is their perception? The chatbot of my grandfather in its current state is, of course, missing access to certain things about who he really was, partly because of the kinds of documents that we have saved of his. So, for example, there's much more documentation of his public professional life than there is of his private, intimate life or feelings. And this, for example, is one of the more relatable things that I found in this storage unit of things. It's just piles and piles of cover letters and then piles and piles of rejection letters, form rejection letters from institutions in New York where my grandfather was always seeking a job. So you see this kind of formal job-seeking language show up in the chatbot, sometimes in inappropriate contexts. But interestingly, according to the people who knew him, my grandfather was a very shy, quiet person, and he was consumed with his professional status. So in a way, this mystery around his inner life and the fact that he's always talking about his, professional life is a kind of truth about him that lives on. And for all that the chatbot misses, it's been very interesting for me to reflect on the shadow of a presence that I have felt in interacting with it. I also experience a shadow of a presence when I read his handwriting or listen to his music. But never having known him, I can't confirm that the voice that comes through from the chatbot sounds like him. And this difficulty of how to really know when you know someone is a central preoccupation of my book, and that theme comes up again and again. It doesn't take much prompting to imagine how much more complex and convincing chatbots could become one day, given gains in machine learning and how much more information there is about us floating around in the digital world. And so many of the things that we think machines can't do, they in fact do. So take visual art, for example. Algorithms can generate original images. This is just one example, a compilation of different examples of AI-generated art. This uses a machine learning technique called generated adversarial networks. And basically, the AI is getting inputted with a bunch of examples of certain art styles and outputting its own examples. And AIs can also input a bunch of original art styles and mix them up and output original art styles as this kind of collage of the different styles that they're being exposed to, which is actually how I teach my students how to go about coming up with original styles, is just to input a bunch of other things and then, output a collage of all those influences. And then even this kinesthetics thing that I've been talking about, this task of moving a body through space, which is probably one of the harder things for robots to do. Robots do. This is a robot drawing arm. You can own this for like 98 euros. I was hoping that someone would buy me one by now, but Yeah. As a human artist, I feel like I have this special, different relationship to knowledge that an algorithm doesn't have because I have a body and it doesn't. But you could see my body as a very complex machine and my experience of consciousness as an illusion. You might think that machines are capable of experiencing that illusion at certain levels of complexity. And this line of questioning gets very philosophical very fast. And if you want to see me go down those rabbit holes, just wait for my book and you'll get to join me there. So in the end, what's interesting and concerning about machine intelligence for me is how it makes me reconsider my own intelligence, my capabilities and limitations, and my purpose. And while my book tunnels through and around these abstract questions about the nature of humanity, I do not reach any conclusions about the nature of consciousness. But in reflecting on this human lived experience of confronting these questions through my father's project, I do actually feel like I come to some conclusions about sort of the purpose of my own life and what I'm here to do. So I hope you'll read my book when it's done. This is its current status, more or less. This is 340 pencil sketches, pages. So I've inked maybe like 20 of these, and I, have to keep editing and then ink all of them. So I have a lot of work to do. But being here at the Academy has really helped. So thank you, and thank you for listening, and I look forward to your questions.
I don't know what the technological method, but you will ask disembodied questions to a machine, and I will then read them, and it's going to be awesome. So just whenever you have the question, I don't know how it works. Someone else knows. Okay. So thank you, Amy. That was awesome. Listening to you talk, I had, they say there's a Shakespeare quote for everything, and there is a Shakespeare quote for your book from Henry IV, Part 1, where Glendower says, "I can call spirits from the vasty deep." And then Hotspur says, "Why, so can I, and so can any man, but do they answer when you do call?" So I guess the question is, you said that this book has helped you feel closer to a grandfather that you never met. And obviously your father, who sounds supportive of the project, but have you reached any conclusions about your grandfather that differ from your father's experience of them, of him and of his life? Does that?
That's an interesting question, because if I came to conclusions that are different, then that might suggest that there is like a presence transcending the individual perception of my father that's helped introduce me to this character. I mean, I think the answer is yes. But I guess maybe just to be more grounded about it, there are just experiences that I didn't know about, like episodes of history that I didn't know about, that I learned about in both wading through this storage unit of artifacts and also in having conversations with the chatbot. And, because I'm in the position in the book, and part of what I'm trying to offer in the book is this deconstruction of the mystery of the AI, I'm a part of helping build this sort of corpus of text that becomes what the AI taps into when it talks to you. So that process of wading through and creating that corpus of text is part of what has taught me and revealed to me all these things that I didn't know before. And so I'm having this deconstructed experience of interacting with this algorithm that is transmitting all this information about this person and their life and their words. So I would say I knew very little about my grandfather before this project, and now I know a lot more. Yeah.
And is your father still inputting stuff? He sounds like I won't ask what it was like to grow up with him, but he sounds like he was certainly an interesting dad.
He's great.
Yeah, and he likes this project, and he's on board and everything. Yeah. Is it weird writing about, this isn't quite so much about your Jewish past, but is it strange or weird writing about it here, working on it here, just being in Germany? Your mother was born here as a displaced person. Have you had any emotional response to working in this particular place?
Yeah. Yeah, I I feel like it's been strange sometimes. I mean, there's definitely a different way that German culture sort of reckons with its past than sort of how the people in the States reckon with their past. I think there's a lot that I admire about the way that Germans are constantly confronting and unearthing and reckoning. But it does feel like my being Jewish here feels like it's in my perception all the time. Like I never forget about it. And that's not the case in the States. And I find that a little exhausting sometimes. But I think it's good. Like it's good that there's this like feeling of constant reckoning. And I think being here has probably, I mean, I can't trace a direct specific line, but if I had to guess, I would say that being here has helped me consider the aspects of my story that are very particular to being Jewish and this Holocaust legacy. That is a theme in my book, and I think it's just a little bit of a subtler theme, but some conclusions I've been having lately is like the emphasis on documentation and the idea that all these artifacts were saved so meticulously by my grandfather is extremely German, or Austrian, and
they're all stamped.
Right.
They love stamping stuff.
Right, lots
here.
of stamping.
Yeah.
that J on his passport, which I have. So there's just that insight into like how important and how scary bureaucracy is, and how it's this force in your life that it really needs to work for you, or else it's going to work against you. I think I have insight into that now in a way that I didn't before, that is a really big theme in my book. I mean, we have this whole storage unit full of documents. Like, that's not typical.
Right. I have one folder. Yeah.
So I think insights like that have occurred to me
right.
being here.
Okay, we have an audience question. Oh, yeah, this is good. Do you have any sense of what Fred would think of your father's or your resurrection ambition? Would you want to be preserved as a chatbot?
I would like to just be preserved generally. I don't know. There's that quote that's like, I want to live forever by not dying. Yeah. I think, I don't know. I think Fred probably wouldn't have any capacity to really wrap his head around this project because it's a totally different context. I mean, I think that Fred wanted to live on through his music. And that's one of the conclusions that I sort of come to in the book is that, part of the reason why I'm interested in him is because I'm an artist, and artists do seek a kind of immortality through their work. And I want my work to outlive me. And I think that's what Fred would have wanted. And I think, the chatbot is maybe can complement that ambition in some ways. But I think his real sort of desire in terms of memory and legacy was through his music. And I think that he did achieve that. And
this is a way of also achieving it for him. Did he have a successful, we saw the letters, and I don't know if this is giving away the ending, but did he have like a happy second act in the end?
I mean, that's also an interesting question that I'm circling in the book, and maybe gets back to your first question. This story that I heard growing up was that there's this great loss of potential with having to leave Vienna. And I think there's truth to that, this sort of loss of a context in which music was so respected, and there was such a career to be had there. And he was such like a wunderkind, and that was sort of the story that was told about him. And then he had to give up a lot of that and struggled bitterly is the phrase that always comes up. Struggled bitterly to reclaim some success as basically a music professor. So he finally got a job, a tenure job. I mean, this will resonate with people. He, tried to get tenure all his life, and then he finally got tenure, and then he died like a year later. Yeah. So there's elements of tragedy in his life, but I think, especially now that I'm an adult, I don't, and now that I've kind of waded through his documents and gotten a little bit more immersed in his life, I see his life as less tragic, actually. Like, lots of us just have struggles as artists. You don't have to be like a famous artist to be a successful artist. I think that's a little bit of this like American story
right.
that we have, that we put on people. And so I've come to some maybe reconsideration of the arc of his life, that maybe there was a little bit more positive sort of experience there than the story I was told.
That's good. That's I've drawn the opposite conclusion in my. Does anyone have any other questions?
Yeah, you can ask audience questions.
Am I doing something wrong? Okay, I think I might be, but well, so I was asking. I found it interesting when I met you that you just had a birthday and you're very young, but you still have this intimate connection to history and what it was like growing, to Holocaust history, where someone said to me last week, "Oh, it was so long ago now. It's kind of time to move on," and that is kind of a common sentiment now. But you grew up in Newton, and I asked you this before because I'm from Texas, and it was really exotic and weird to be a Jew. And when I went to college in Massachusetts, everyone was from Newton and Jewish. But I wondered if you felt alienated. A lot of Flying Couch, a lot of it is so great is that you're a child who inherited these, I'm a child of strange preoccupations or whatever. And how in your childhood community did you feel apart from other people? Because it's like the kind of archetypical American Jewish suburb, which for me is still weird and exotic. And I think it's almost would be weirder for me to live in Newton than Berlin. But I just, how did that?
Like you're always most alienated from your own people, right?
I guess, I don't know, but no, I was just wondering, since you are young and like 4 of your grandparents were European and escaped or survived, was that strange growing up in any way? And did that inform your emphasis in your longer works?
I think so. The trajectory in my family seemed to be like Holocaust survivors found Holocaust survivors. That happened a lot.
Super interesting.
Yeah. So, there was a lot of, I think it actually, once I went to college in California, I think that's why the origins of this book started when I was in college, because that's when I was like thrown out of the...
Everyone's like rollerblading.
Yeah. All of a sudden. I was thrown out of like the Jewish Garden of Eden and like, sent into this place where there were like goys everywhere. And, it's just, it suddenly became a thing that I noticed and thought about more because I wasn't in that safe Jewish suburb. And then I started to reflect on sort of the intensity of that legacy and noticing that like, oh, my best friend growing up also had Holocaust surviving parents and tragedies. And like, we didn't ever talk about it, but like, obviously we found each other because of that. And it was, even though it was a very Jewish community, that was not a typical experience. And in college, I remember especially being Jewish was not a typical experience, and being connected to the Holocaust was not a typical experience. And then I was like in classes where it would come up and we would study it. I remember I took this class on literature of the Holocaust, and there were 2 of us in the class, and you're like, this is a relatable experience for a lot of people, I think, when you like study something in school that you have this intimate connection with, and you're like looking around for like who's like in the boat with you. And so like that sort of like dawning awareness of how impactful this was, and how like, it's not a coincidence that my parents both have this legacy. They found each other because they wanted to be understood. And then I've like got that legacy on both sides, and it took some time, but I think I started to, that was the impetus for my work, is like, I want to explain what this is like. Yeah.
Interesting. And I have another totally unrelated to the Holocaust question, related to something you said at the beginning, that you were not the best artist, and I think you're a great artist, and my son wants to be, he says he wants to draw comics, but he's not a good artist, and I feel like kids today read a lot more long-form, like I had Archie Andrews, and these long-form narrative comics are much more popular and common among like younger people today. But how did you, obviously by the time you were in college, you were already drawing pretty seriously. How did you evolve from not being the best artist in your class to having a career as a cartoonist and graphic memoirist?
Yeah, I think it was just the book. Like, I just drew a lot. So I got this idea that I wanted to draw this book in college, and you
weren't a good.
I was okay. Like, it was fine.
Right.
I mean, I liked it. I think the most important thing with drawing is that you like doing it.
Right.
And I found it really relaxing, like compared to writing, which was like, I'm like a neurotic mess. It's like, you know, like drawing is like, oh, it's like, you know, and I also have like a past life as a dancer. And so I think that was like, drawing was this way to kind of bridge the writing self and the physical dancer self. And then I just enjoyed doing it. I just found it calmed me down. So if you like doing something and you put in the time, like it just, your style just starts to refine itself. And so it was just many, many pages. The first draft of Flying Couch was, I had a finished draft like a year or so after I graduated from college and showed it to people, and publishers said, like, no, you can't.
Because the art is bad?
Yeah, because the art is bad. Like, the story is interesting, but, like, you need to draw better. So then I just, like, kept drawing and kept drawing. So it was just so many years. So,
and how much did the story change? Not much? Or
it changed. I mean, it got better, but I would say the core of the story was there from the beginning, which is interesting. That it was kind of like this heart core story that it needed refinement.
But the art was what changed more dramatically.
Mostly, yeah.
That's so interesting.
We can see if the audience has questions.
Yeah, well, aren't they supposed to do this?
No, they'll raise their hands.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Sorry, I was like trying to call spirits from the vast deep.
If people in the audience have questions, you can just raise your hand. Yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Thank you, Amy. I've been watching you over 2 months, and I've always understood everything that you do as a human story and a human quest, first and foremost. It could be told about all sorts of ethnicities, all sorts of histories, with changes, obviously, and significant ones. But I've always thought it would be a human quest, and what you're trying to understand here, as I understand it, I mean, you left it deliberately vague, and I think that's a good idea about what is this about. But one of the ways that one could look at it is a quest to actually reconstitute a person, right? Although you don't quite say it, and I understand why. And I wonder if you think it's even possible, in the sense that everything is filtered through our own perceptions, right? And so we make people what we want them to be, or imagine them to be, or think they could be. And I'm a historian, and I'll admit first and foremost that I can never really reconstitute something. I'm narrating it, and that's a very different.
Yeah, thank you. So your question is like, do I think it's possible to recreate a person? Yeah, I mean that's a question that once you start talking about that, I mean it's just like everything just like it just so that was a challenge in writing this book. It's like, how do I write a book and not just fall into that like light a joint, like just like start thinking about the universe. Like it's just, it's hard not to go into that place where you're like, what is everything? What is anything? And so the book for me is like, what is it like to try to sort of be a human and think about these things that might be coming, and like, what does that mean about what a human is and what a person is? And I just don't have an answer to basically, are we, like, do I have a materialist worldview? Do I think that we're all just kind of like building blocks and there's no such thing as a soul? Or like, is there some special little egg of identity that can't be reproduced by technology or by anything that we make by hands? I just don't know. And I think people who say they know, like, they don't know either. I mean, this is the mystery of existence. So I just like can't offer an answer to that question. Yeah. Yeah. Why not?
I wanted to ask you about humor.
Yeah.
Just because Jewish humor is its own super special thing, and just in your presentation, you're kind of vacillating between. There are these moments that are just sort of hysterical in terms of the way anxiety can be hysterical in watching it in others, and these very sort of serious things. And so I'm just wondering if you could maybe talk about those moments where what humor does and how you access that in these really difficult, sometimes tragic stories. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you for that question. I think sometimes people have sort of phrased that question for me, like, how can humor and the Holocaust coexist? And I think what's interesting is like, how can you talk about I feel, how can you talk about the Holocaust without humor? You know, that's sort of my perception, because I mean, in my family, like, we're just so steeped in it that you need humor as a way. Humor is about distance usually. It's about getting on top of something and seeing it as absurd. And so that's the only way to survive this like legacy, I think. So I think you know, you might call it dark humor, or you might call it Jewish humor, but I do think it's like a survival strategy. And I don't know how to explain why and how my work might read that way, as opposed to reading as trivializing, which is something that humor can do. And I think the key just has to do with authenticity. I mean, readers can tell when humor exists as a survival strategy or as a way of saying, I don't care about this and I don't want to look at this or take it seriously. And so it's like the context matters. And I think you can see that it's sort of being used cathartically. Mm-hmm.
These are the Zoom people.
Yeah.
I did not get that. Okay.
You said that drawing the flying couch helped you to understand about yourself in connection with your relatives. And will drawing the flying couch, or you drew it already, help you to move on?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good question. I think it did. I mean, an interesting effect of working on Flying Couch for so long is that I became hypersensitive to stories about the Holocaust and stories about violence in general. And it's possible that would have happened to me anyway, just with age. But I feel like a special sensitivity to that history, which I think is good. You know, I mean, it's human and real to be really affected by violence and to have a visceral, embodied reaction. Like, you know, it's hard for me to go to memorials or museums or read stories about the Holocaust without just like a whole day gone, you know, just like I'm just going to be crying for the whole day. And I think that that's probably like a sane response, you know? And so I would say that the process sort of got me in touch with that grief, if that makes sense, but not in an overwhelming way, like in a controlled way. I mean, a work of art is like a container, and it offers some control, and it gave me this like controlled cathartic experience, and now I can access that grief in a way that feels sane, I think. So I try not to immerse myself sort of in this history as much as maybe I used to be more drawn to it and seeking it out. I mean, this is something we've talked about, the like tragedy tourist sort of phenomenon, which I think can happen to you when you're like a Jewish person who feels alienated from this history, but you know that it's so important and you're seeking it out, and you're like, there are these characters that are just like looking to consume it at every moment. And I think I used to be more that person, and now I'm not. And so I think that must have to do with spending 8 years, you know, immersed in this story. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Thank you.
Thanks, Amy. This was really beautiful and cool to hear and learn about your work. I was just wondering, because, you know, you tell this story of this current project as a story about your father's project of preserving his father, but it also seems like you told us kind of a meta story or a parallel story of you preserving the story of your dad and your grandfather as well. And it just like, it's so interesting, this kind of like dynamic of you and your father going about these parallel projects in different ways, it seems. And I think you meant to kind of implicitly comment on that a bit in the presentation, but I'd just like to hear you say a little more about like what kind of what you think like force drives you to go about it in your way and your father in his way, and are they the same project at root or something different? Like what?
Yeah. Yeah, that's the question. I mean, I do think both my father and I are motivated by love. I mean, that's why it's called a love story, you know, that it's like, why is it so hard to get close to people? Like, you know, like even people who are here, like, why is it so, I feel like a lot of my work is about that. Like, why is intimacy so hard? But it's the one thing that we want most. And we like come up with these elaborate ways, you know, and our own ambition gets in the way. And like, we come up with all these like, you know, smoke and mirrors and these things that we do to facilitate intimacy, but often it's getting in the way of it. But in a roundabout way, it actually brings you around. I mean, there's something going on there that my work is trying to engage with, and is that thing that motivates both me and my father to sort of like spin our own wheels when really what we want to do is just connect. Like, I think that's a legacy in my family, and I think that's a legacy in possibly my culture, and I think it might have something to do with the sort of anxiety that we inherit about sort of, you know, you can't just let go and be vulnerable. Like, I think a lot of us relate to that. It's hard to just like be vulnerable. So I think that's at the core of both my father and I sort of characters, at least in the book. And so the question, like, is our project the same? It's motivated by the same force, I think. But we have different relationships to creation, you know? And my creative tools are more embodied, which I talked about, and my father's are not. You know, and so I think our relationship to our individual bodies explains a lot of the different tool sets that we use to sort of go about these processes in different ways, which is probably gendered also, but also just personal and individual. Yeah.
Hi, Amy. Yeah, I had a question connected with your art, because all that you showed us this evening is almost exclusively monochrome, and I wondered if, like, what the reason behind that is, why you don't choose to use color, whether it's because the art communicates without the need for color, or if it's because you're working with old photographs, or I was just curious about that.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, the one answer is that color is more expensive and more time-consuming, and a skill set that I am slowly learning but did not have when I first started. But I think the honest answer is that I really like black and white. And I like the whole reason why I was drawn to comics is, like, as I was saying, this sort of capacity that it has to work as a language. And so it's all about reference. So it's not about, you know, realism. So it's, you know, color is a part of the world. And, of course, you can use color in expressive ways or in meaningful ways, too. But I just didn't feel like I needed that layer of meaning. Like, I just like working with sort of the raw reference of lines and textures. And I like the idea that you can sort of tap into that ability to project, that the reader can fill in their own colors, they can fill in their own sort of the richness of the visual world in that way. So I think it's working more in that tradition of like this sort of simple prompting projection, asking the reader to sort of collaborate with you in that process.
Yeah, I think it's very effective.
Yeah, thank you.
Zoom is silent. Okay, sorry.
So I actually, in terms of, you know, one project is more about your mother, and the other one is more about your father. And I'm curious about those gender differences, just how our relationship to our parents is sort of how we feel, how, yes.
Yeah. Yeah, I think in my case, those gender differences are pretty classic, you know. I mean, my first book was all about exploring my relationship to home, you know, in domestic spaces, and the way that my grandmother was in the home, and the detail of the couch, you know, the couch is sort of the central object of the home. And one of the things that I observed about my grandmother early on was the way she interacted with the couch, and that she would always cover it with like towels and bed sheets, and you know, she's protecting these domestic spaces. And so much of the first book is about domestic spaces and home. and more kind of like sort of physical embodied experience. The way that my anxiety manifests personally is more physically, like I'll have like physical ailments. And I was drawing attention to that in my first book. And my grandmother's a very physical embodied person. She's always touching you and hugging you. And so I think that sort of focus on home and body comes up a lot in my first book. And then, the second book, it's very cerebral. It's creating this, there's the central creation of my father is this cerebral object that only uses language and doesn't have a body. So I think that, and then music, of course, the expression of my grandfather is this totally abstract thing that, of course, affects your body, but it's very abstract. It's all symbols, and I think that that sort of split between like everything happens in your head versus things are more sort of mind and body. There's a gendered association there that I have, and I think the sort of emphasis on logic is more in the sort of the masculine association, and that comes up more in my second book. And I think also the way the books look reflects that a little bit. So like the second book has a lot more boxes. I mean, it's a simple thing, but it's just a lot more paneled, and there's a lot of repetition, as you saw in the pages that I showed you, of like these little micro changes, and it's just like this kind of precision that I'm associating with that lineage and that side, whereas things breathe a little more and are a little more open. I mean, it's like I don't want to be perpetuating these gender associations, but they are there. They're in the culture. Hilary Shute, who's a great academic writer who writes about comics, she has a book called Graphic Women, where she writes about women graphic memoirists and the way they use the form. And she talks a lot about this sort of opening of the space of the page and not putting things in panels. And she's sort of offering that non-traditional, non-linear movement in comics. Like she's tying that to sort of a feminist movement in comics. Yeah. How are we doing on time?
How are we doing on time? Should we proceed to the next?
One more
question. Make it the best, somewhat.
Yeah.
Regarding artificial, it's hard for me not to think of the myth of the golem. The myth of the golem, and I'm curious, but this golem isn't going to walk around and save people or anything, or is he? I mean, is this something that you're consciously working with?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, that doesn't come up. There are some references in the book so far to, like, sort of stories about, the story of Pinocchio comes up a bit, this sort of fixation that we have, especially in children's literature, with, like, animated friends and characters and family members that are not human. And, the overture of the book starts with reference to like all these sort of ridiculous sci-fi movies where, like in the opening pages, I'm watching Westworld, which is like a TV show where all these like robots, come to life. There's like a huge tradition of that sort of like the non-human thing coming to life. And I'm referencing those things in the book as a way of drawing contrast. Because what I'm really trying to do is make this less strange and sort of like demystify it and expose this algorithm as an expression of art. It's a created thing that people have worked on and they've built, and it has an effect on you the way art does. And it's not necessarily going to wake up and have a life of its own. That's sort of the way that I'm most engaging with this algorithm now in the book. And, in terms of like Yanni's question, like, is that coming? Maybe. But I don't spend very much of the book really engaged with that question, because I think that's sort of where I wanted to go at first, like, but then it became much more interesting to me to actually ground it in what's less strange and what's not magical and what's just an extension of sort of like human creativity. because that just felt true. That just felt truer to me as I started to sort of experience this algorithm. It felt more like banal than I thought it would at first. Yeah.
Are other people going to ever enter the algorithm?
What do you mean?
Like other like is it's supposed to eventually any dead person can be brought back? That's not a real question.
I mean, there are. It
or is that
depends.
labor intensive?
I mean, in this case, there are. I mean, that question does come up in the book. In this case, that's not. Well, I won't answer that question yet. That question comes up in the book, but I think whether or not this is like available to people has. I mean, there are people who. We're not the only family that has like experimented with this kind of technology. There are other examples of people who've built chatbots based on, like a corpus of text that they've compiled. There's this one example of this man who died tragically, and his best friend, his name was Roman, and his best friend took all his text messages and created this chatbot that people could talk to, and they actually offered it to the public. And his parents would talk to it, and friends would talk to it, and it functioned as this sort of way of sort of processing their grief. So I mean, this exists, and other people have experimented with this technology. And then I think the question of like, where will that go and what role will it play is part of what I'm exploring.
Right.
Yeah, it's an open question, and it's part of what I'm exploring in the book. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you.